All right, everyone, welcome to this week's webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist, and this week we're going to be talking about XojoScript. All right, so I'm going to just click right here on the language reference page for XojoScript. This is where you're going to find pretty much all the specific details of the nitty-gritties, but we're going to go through quite a few examples today, and hopefully they'll give you some ideas for why you want to use XojoScript. But before we do that, I want to remind everyone to feel free to ask questions as I'm talking. They show up on my other screen. I can address them as appropriate. And without further ado, let's get started. So what is XojoScript? Well, it's a way for you to run user-created Xojo code within your own applications. That's pretty cool. It uses the LLVM compiler behind the scenes, actually. And it's sandboxed. So it means that the user only has access to the Xojo language. They don't have access to the Xojo framework or anything like that. So there's no classes they can use, but you can create your own classes within the Xojo code itself. You can also create your own methods and functions and pretty much anything else you can do from a language standpoint. You can use a method right here, or a property, the context property, with XojoScript to provide an interface between the sandbox Xojo environment and your own application. And we'll look at some examples for how that works. So that's what XojoScript is. But why would you use it? Well, the primary reason you would want to use XojoScript is to extend your application for your power users. You can provide a XojoScript mechanism so that your power users can write little scripts they can then run against your application that will allow it to do things that might otherwise have been harder or very manual or require a lot of steps, that sort of thing. Another reason you might want to use XojoScript is because you can get a little bit of performance if you have some code that is strictly relying on the language, not the framework, and you want to take advantage of the LLVM compiler that is used by XojoScript. So that is another reason why you might find it useful. And another reason you might find XojoScript useful is to take advantage of its built-in parsing capability, because it is, a programming language there, and you can do some little things that that might save you some time or might have been hard for you to program otherwise. So speaking of which, let's take a look at an example that does some parsing here. Now this example here lets you type in a simple expression, and I can type in something like, and then I can choose to press the button to evaluate it, and I'll get back what the result would be in the results field here. So you can see it parsed this particular expression and gave me back the result. I could also do some mathematical functions and get back answers. Writing your own parser can be rather complicated, I suppose. There's like some of the examples below show, you can actually type in some of the math functions and get results. So, but this is all built into XojoScript by its nature of being able to compile programming languages. So this little example here will show you how you can use XojoScript to take advantage of that. So let's see what the very simple code looks like. All right, so we have our main window here. Nothing too fancy. There's an eval button that just strips out what it was that you typed into the field. And it's using this evaluator class, which is right down here, to actually do the processing. And as you can see, looking at the icon and looking over in the inspector, evaluator is a subclass of XojoScript. And I'll just expand the event handlers and the properties so we can see all that. So the main thing is the eval method, which is what is called to actually process the expression that the user typed. And what we have here is just some simple code that you can see here, just as inline string in this particular method, that is assigning what was typed into the expression field to a variant. And then it's evaluating the variant and retaining the result. And then it sends that back using the context object so that we have the result, which is then displayed to the user in the window. So you can see very, very simple. I mean, there's really only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines of XojoScript code that is being run to evaluate the expression, but it's taking advantage of the built-in capabilities of the Xojo language to parse that expression for you. So looking at that, I mean, very, very simple. The magic in this is the fact that the variant can evaluate any type of expression. So it allows it to check if it's returning a number and then get the double of the number and convert it back to a string, because that's what this property is. Otherwise, it just gets the string value. Now, this is making use of the context method so that we can easily get this value back to ourselves, back to our application. Because remember, the stuff running in XojoScript is sandboxed. It can't communicate with your application under normal circumstances. So what we've done is we've set the context object to be itself, and since this is a class, we just set it to be the class itself. And that gives it access to the properties and methods on the class. In this particular case, the only one we care about is this mResult property, which is declared right here. So because it's a property on the class, the XojoScript code can actually use it and assign a value to it. And that's what results in the value getting returned and then displayed in the on the user interface. There's other event handlers that are part of XojoScript that can be used to capture when errors occur. And this particular one is capturing compiler errors and runtime errors. And both of those can occur. A compiler error would be if they type an expression that isn't a valid command in Xojo, and then that will generate a compiler error, which is calling this error code to string method, which if you use XojoScript in any of your applications, this is the sort of method. You're going to see this method kind of in all the little projects we look at. You're probably just going to want to copy this thing over to your project and use it. And it converts the enumeration of the error values into some text that can be displayed to the user. And then the runtime error just displays the runtime messages. So you can see what would happen if they got an error by typing in something that is invalid. So, you know, typing in just a name that's not an expression, so it's returning a compilation error as an undefined identifier. And I imagine something like this probably would return another compilation error. So you get to see what that sort of thing is. So that's what the evaluator project does. And you can, of course, you can use this evaluator class in your own projects if you have expressions like this that you do need to evaluate in some manner. This is a pretty simple one just to get you started. And we're going to jump from this into a more complicated one, complicated XojoScript example, before we look at a couple others that let you write your own XojoScripts. All right, so this one here has some much longer and more complex scripts that are manipulating graphics. I'm just going to select the first one here. And I'll make this a little bigger. So you can see this is a very lengthy XojoScript. Actually declares the script inside a module. There's actually functions within the module, subroutines, or methods, and then it has essentially the main part of the code that calls the module and then calls a method on it with a bunch of parameters. Now let's just run this so you can see what it does. Not that I expect anyone to understand this code, but just an example of the sophistication you can do with XojoScript. Now you can see that particular code here creates this fractal image, which is neat. And this particular example, it does time how long it takes. You can see here the compilation on this one was very, very quick, and the runtime took about 8.8 seconds. Now, when you turn on the compiler optimizations for XojoScript, which there are various levels of compiler optimizations, the more you optimize, the longer it takes to compile, but theoretically, your code should run faster. And we should see that here when I run this. The compilation time should end up being a little bit slower, and the runtime should end up being a little bit faster. So you can see that it ran almost 2 seconds faster, and the compilation took not less than a second slower. But that can make a difference if you tend to be doing a lot of math-related stuff like this, where the LLVM compiler would provide a benefit. Oops, I wanted to run the other example so you can see that. Didn't mean to quit. So there's another one here. This one just converts a image to black and white, and you can see it runs very quickly, and it can also run even faster when the optimizations are turned on. And you can see, again, this has a module with a bunch of functions and whatnot that can be called. Now, remember I said that XojoScript is sandboxed, so it can't directly communicate with your application. Now, you can use the context method to communicate with your application, but you have to implement these communication points. There is a restriction on the context method, however. You cannot pass objects back and forth between XojoScript and your application. So, but this particular example appears to be manipulating a picture or an image. So how is it doing that if it can't pass the picture object back and forth? Well, let's take a look. It is kind of doing that the old school way. So first we can look at the run button and see some of the setup code, specifying the context object, specifying the source code from whatever happens to be in that text area, starting a timer, determining if it's doing no optimizations or the most optimizations it can do. And then it runs the script. But if you look at the context object, you're going to see down here, there are 4 methods that are available. These can be used in the XojoScript as if they were methods in the language that you yourself have just added. And these particular things, rather than manipulating objects, are doing things using the basic data types of string, integer, color, that sort of stuff. And so you can see set pixels is just setting, well, actually the one I want is, yeah, probably was that one. But if you look at the code, I'm going to open it up right here. You can see it's calling this method way down here at the bottom. After it does its own little looping in math using individual pixels in an array, it calls the method to set it on in the context object, which then passes the array in. And then once you've got this array of data in your own application, then in your application, you can parse this data, move it onto a picture, and then display it for the user. So that becomes the interface point between the XojoScript and the application. So like I said, this is a more sophisticated example of the XojoScripts themselves. So we kind of jump between a little basic example and a sophisticated example of some complex Xojo scripts that are doing graphics related stuff. So let's take a look at an example here that will allow you to essentially create your own Xojo scripts. Now this project simply lets you type code, XojoScript code into the top area, and then you can run it. And if there are errors or whatnot, they're displayed down here at the bottom. So let's look at the example that's included with it. So you can see this is a simple Xojo script that does the guess the number game. So if we run this, we get a prompt. So I can tell it we want to guess between 1 and 10, and I can start guessing. Oh, look at that. I guessed right the first time. It only took me one guess. But as you can see, it does the little checking to see if it's higher or lower or whatnot. And you can see that this is a pretty straightforward little piece of programming that pretty much anyone ought to be able to understand. It does have a few different commands in here that we haven't used before, input and print. And these are used to interface output. So these those two commands call events on the XojoScript class that you can implement to display information in a manner or prompt the user for information. Right now, I've implemented, and we'll look at the code, the print event handler to actually just display what's passed in that little message box or the sheet that's slid down from the top. But we'll look at a web version of this that instead displays that information in just another text area at the bottom. And this particular thing is using input to put up a dialog where the user can type something and then get a result back. Now, if I make a compilation error somewhere by having gobbledygook in my code, you can see down here the errors and warnings that appear. We already had a couple warnings that were showing up. There's now an error that I just added by an undefined identifier. And I can click on it, and it takes me right to the line that's in error. Because the XojoScript event handlers do provide information as to the line where the error occurred, and even specifically which characters in the line caused the error. You can also see there are warnings that are appearing here. And this is telling me that there's a warning with converting from val into an integer. There could be some precision loss. Not in this particular case that I care about, but it is pointing these things out. And these are the same sort of warnings that you would get, when you're using Xojo yourself and you were analyzing your project and you had those types of warnings enabled. And you can, of course, this thing allows you to write any code you want, and it'll attempt to run it. So let's look at how this works. So looking at the script window, there's a XojoScript control that was added to it that appears down here on the shelf, which I will expand so you can see all its event handlers. The run button just calls the run script method. And you can see here, this is just doing the usual stuff you see with XojoScript. Set the source code, set the context, precompile with optimization levels, and then you run it. The input and print event handlers that I talked about are implemented here. And you can see this, the event handler passes in whatever you sent in as the string after the print command. And this particular code is just creating a message dialog and then showing the string that was passed in it. And input kind of does the reverse. So there's a window, the input window that is displayed and gets returns a value that is returned from the event handler so that the script can use it. Now, moving on to the compiler errors, you'll see here there are two calls to add message, which is down here. We're going to look at in a moment, and the runtime error, which is just displaying that in a dialog. Now, this one here here it is. So this is just taking essentially that compilation error message and then displaying it in the list box. A little nicer, putting some red highlighting if it's an error and yellowish if it's a warning, and getting the line numbers passed in and whatnot. But you'll notice it's calling this error code to string method that I had mentioned earlier. That is happily right here, and like I said, used in pretty much any XojoScript project if you want to be able to have a nice text error message that people can understand. So this is just adding it to the list box. All right, and then script context down here. Now the context method, right now I've only added one method to the context, and that's used by our little game of guess the number. Had to actually pick a number to guess, and so it needed a way to generate a random number. Well, that's not built into the Xojo script or the Xojo language because that's a class. So how can we get a random number? Well, what I've done here is I've created a method, which I call random. And in my script context, when it's created, I declare a new instance of the random class and assign it to a property. And then my random method just returns a value in the range that is specified. So if we look at that source code, maybe we can find its usage. Here it is right here. So you can see we're using random as a method here, specifying the start value and the end value, and we get back an integer of the random number, just like it's described here. So essentially, I've started to implement my own little commands to the XojoScript language that are needed by my application. And you can add anything you want here. You can, create your own methods to do whatever you need. We're going to look at shortly another project that will show how to use this in a more practical aspect to provide access to a working application. But I mean, whatever you dream up that your application needs for an interface, you can just implement within the context and provide some access to it. All right, just checking my notes here. All right, let's look at a version of this application that is running as a web application. Now, the same techniques work in web applications. So yes, you can use XojoScript in your web applications. You can see this sort of layout's pretty much the same. This code is going to roll two dice together a bunch of times and then calculate how often each number comes up. So you can see here, looking at the results, that 6 and 7 come up most often. 12 and 2 don't come up very often at all, about what you expect, but it's good to get the overall frequency of those values and show this off. So you can see how this is, again, pretty straightforward Xojo language code within the XojoScript. There's an array, some regular integers, a couple for loops, and then printing results out to the screen. There's also this one is set up with a segmented control to show the output or errors if there are any errors. Add error by putting in a bad command or something. And you can see the error and the description also appears here. It doesn't highlight the line though because the web text area doesn't have that capability. But otherwise it works pretty much the same. It doesn't have the ability to do inputs though. And that's, I won't necessarily say a limitation of a web application, but web applications do run asynchronously, so they can't pause in the middle to wait for input. I haven't yet figured out if I can come up with a good way to allow that sort of pausing. I don't know that there is. So I'm still looking into that. But for now, that just means you need to provide in the inputs for the script before it starts and then run the script. And we've got different, I got another example here I can run in here. Let's copy this one. This here is an implementation of a bubble sort. And this shows how you can have a XojoScript that has its own methods built into here. So there's a method here called showNumbers that's going to display the numbers in the array in their current order. And then there's implementation here of the bubble sort, and it will just go through and bubble up the smallest values to the front. So you can see the original order, unsorted. And after the first pass of the bubble sort, the 1 has bubbled its way up. And as you can see, scrolling through the list, the 1 continues to bubble up till it gets to the front. And this particular bubble sort is actually a slightly more efficient one in that it's bubbling up multiple values at once if it can. Not that any version of bubble sort is terribly efficient, but there it is with this small data set. All right, I got just a comment here from Terry that says he's still trying to figure out why he'd want to use or would need XojoScript. So that tells me it's now time to look at our little example here that will show how you might use this in a more practical aspect. And the web application here is by and large the same layout. Before I jump to that, I just point that out. It pretty much has the same implementation as the desktop one. Control added to the web page, a run button, same general methods and whatnot. So there's not a lot of implementation differences here, but it's more to demonstrate that it does work with the web applications. All right, a few webinars ago, last year sometime, I did a webinar to create Xojo text, a little text editor written in Xojo. This is it right here. Well, this version's been slightly modified. It now has a script menu, and it will run Xojo scripts, and will run them against whatever text happens to be displayed in the text editor. So let's open up some text here. So I've implemented some methods in my XojoScript context method that provides access to the text that's displayed right here. And that allows me to create Xojo scripts that can manipulate this in certain ways. So let's run a couple and we'll run through them and see. So the first very simple one here is this select all script. It just has one command called select all, not a Xojo script command. That's something I implemented in the context. And when I run this, you'll see it's selected all the text. Not too exciting. If you've never read a Edgar Rice Burroughs' Princess of Mars, the main character is called John Carter. And this next script will rename the main character to something else, something Smith, I believe. Let's see. So it'll replace all instances of John with Sam and Carter with Smith. So it's renaming the main character to Sam Smith. And you can see, boom, the text all changed here. Now, you'll notice it missed a couple. I forgot that in some places in the story, he's also referred to as Jack. Probably not a lot. The book is written in the first person, except for this first section. But nonetheless, I missed one. So I could update that script to add another command that says replace Jack. And I could replace all kinds of things. So this sort of thing might be useful if you're were getting text from someone, then you were in charge of editing and you needed to run a bunch of replacements on the text before you did your editing on it or whatever. But doing that by hand with just a regular find and replace window might be a bit tedious. All right, so that did some text replacements. What's the next one here? Speak selected text. So let me select some text first. Hopefully this plays. My mic picks it up.
In submitting Captain Smith's strange manuscript to you in book form, I believe that a few words relative to this remarkable personality will be of interest.
So you can see it did that. And then the last script is a little bit more complicated that I'll run against this text. And it will scan all the words in the text and put together a sorted list of all unique words, essentially something along the lines of an index. Now, it didn't actually do anything because it put those words in the clipboard. So I'm here just going to open a new document from the clipboard. And you can see we now have a list of all the unique words that are in this particular section of the book. And I could be beefing this up so that I was counting each instance of unique word and tracking that, doing all kinds of things, I suppose. But that's what I decided to do for this particular one. So this shows how you might have a pre-existing application that actually does something. This particular one's a text editor. Doesn't do a heck of a lot. It's a very simple text editor. But how you can provide some power functionality to it by attaching XojoScript and making that available. So let's look at what the context object and some of these scripts might look like. Let's see. First, I'll open up the scripts. I guess I'll open them right up here in the Xojo text editor. So the select all script, just one line of code, select all. The replace script is just calling this replace all method. And again, these are implemented as context object methods, which we'll look at how they're implemented in a moment. This one declares a variable, gets whatever the selected text happens to be, which is again a context object method, and then calls the context object method to speak it. This longer one loops through, first it gets the text, and then once you have the text, you can use any of these the Xojo script commands to do whatever you need to do here. And this is looping through and calculating, going through the text and finding each word, and then adding it to an array if it's not already in the array. And then at the end, it's sorting the array, and then it is converting it back to a giant string, and then putting that string in the clipboard. Anything, and I've mentioned before, that is allowing it to interface back to the Xojo text application is done using the context. So let's see what that looks like. I'll leave that open for now. So you can see there's a variety of methods on here, and these are the sort of things in your own applications that would be communicating with your application in some manner. Maybe it's fetching data from the database, or in this case, it's getting or setting information that happens to be in the text editor. Whatever makes sense for your particular application. But it allows you to have your user write the scripts so that you don't have to necessarily implement all this stuff in the application in some manner yourself. So you can see, and none of these are terribly sophisticated methods in any way. They're just providing access to the information that is otherwise not accessible through the XojoScript. So this is just returning the text that happens to be in the editor. This just is calling the speak method on whatever text you pass in. Select clipboard, set clipboard, just sets the text that's passed in and puts it in the clipboard. A lot of these just are going to map directly to methods that might already exist, but that cannot be accessed from within XojoScript. I have other ones in here that I don't think I actually used. This does a copy of text that returns the end of line character. So you can see that this is how this particular stuff is interfacing or provides the interface method to your application through XojoScript. Let me just check over here on my notes and my comments or questions. All right, let's see here. Oblio is got a thing. He says he's trying to understand why he would need to use it in a compiled app. Could easily add this to the app without XojoScript. Well, I don't know that you could easily provide a way for users to write code, their own code without XojoScript, unless you were writing your own parser and whatnot. But it all depends what your application needs. Not all applications are going to need this level of power user capability. Certainly not. Probably many won't. XojoScript's a very specialized feature, and many, if not most, apps are going to have no use for it whatsoever. But when you do need it, it is just a really fast and easy way to provide this capability to your users. All right, let's see. Jeremy's noting that they use XojoScript in a billing system, and they have a billing script that they use for clients that allows them to more easily calculate what is being owed. And they reading his other comment, lots of other ways that they use this as well. Let's see here, and Oblio is also asking if this can be used for debugging apps when compiled. I don't really know what that means, so I don't think I can answer that. XojoScript's for running scripts. That doesn't really have anything to do with your app that is running. It is they run on their own in a sandbox, and they can interface with your app, but they're not really going to help you much with debugging of your app. Let's see here. Now, the tricky part with let me go back here. The tricky part with if you do decide that you want to open up your application to power users in this way is you first of all have to give your users a way to actually write scripts. And writing scripts in a text editor is easy enough, but you don't they're not going to get a list of commands or code completion or something like that. So that becomes extra things that you may have to implement in your application or provide as a standalone one if you do want users to be able to create apps of some kind. We also have here on the wiki page a list of the language and functions that can be used within XojoScript. So you can scan this to see the commands that can be used, the data types that can be used. The keywords are the ones in the keywords category. So just the keywords, again, no classes or whatnot. And then there's a variety of global functions that you can use within XojoScript that primarily work on simple data types, strings, and number values. So if we go back to this Xojo text example, adding XojoScript to this already working example involved just a little bit of code. First, I added a new run script menu and implemented its menu handler. And this just lets you prompt for a text file that contains a script, assigns that script to the source of a script runner XojoScript control that was added to the window, assigns the context object to that as well, and then again does a precompile and runs it. This isn't doing any real error handling to speak of beyond just showing a little message box if there's a compilation error, which certainly is better than nothing. But if you were providing this functionality for your power users in your application, you probably would want to make it easier for them and provide better error messages and error handling. But that's the code that was added here. And then the only other thing that was added was the context object with these methods for the interfacing. And that's it. Those two steps added the XojoScript ability to your application. And then I just wrote the various scripts that could make use of these context object methods to do what they needed to do. So depending on your application, it may be easy to add this. But depending on your application, it may make no sense whatsoever to add this. It really depends on what your application is, how it's used by your users, and what functionality makes sense. I mean, XojoScript is a programming system. Like anything else, that's going to require some pretty serious level of skill on the part of your users that do want to take advantage of this. So you'll need to consider if that's worth the support and other factors. But it may make sense to implement XojoScript in this manner so that you don't have to, say, clutter up your user interface with all kinds of things that might give power users what they need. And in particular, that involves, a lot of iterative type stuff, looping through information, finding data more easily, doing bulk operations, stuff like that. That lends itself well to programming, but doesn't tend to lend itself well to user interface. Let's see here. I'm checking the questions again. Charles is asking if Apple allows applications with XojoScript to be sold through the Apple Store. Yes, absolutely. The Mac App Store has no restrictions on XojoScript or apps that use it for that matter. iOS Store would probably have huge restrictions around its use, but the Mac App Store does not. Terry is asking if you can use ODBC plugin stuff in XojoScript. Well, again, you can't use anything in XojoScript except the language itself and the very few global functions that were declared there on the wiki page. If you needed to provide access to database information, you would need to do it through a context method. Now, if you wanted to provide a way for users to write a XojoScript that fetched data out of a database, for example, you would have to write a method here that, you would add a method, whatever, fetch data by name, and you could give it a parameter for them to pass in, and you could return this information again to XojoScript using one of the base types. So you could pass it back as an array, if that made sense, a string of some kind that was delimited, something like that. And that would provide the information back to the user. And you kind of have to think up your own API, if you will, your own programming interface, because that's what you're creating, that matches your application and is something that will be usable for the people that you want to take advantage of this. But you cannot directly access anything that's outside of the sandbox. So that means no direct database access from within XojoScript, no file access, nothing like that. It's all through the context object. And that's a good thing because you wouldn't want people to be able to write any XojoScripts willy-nilly that all of a sudden we're manipulating files on the file system or more monkeying around with your database. That would obviously be a bad thing. And that does bring up a point that if you do decide to use this in web applications, you do have to consider the fact that how are people going to run these scripts? I mean, you want to make sure it's done through a logged in user and that you're not providing access to information that they shouldn't have access to or shouldn't be allowed to change or that sort of thing. Like many of the advanced topics in Xojo, these are not the sort of things that you're going to be using every day, not even close. They're the sort of things that are pretty powerful, and in special cases are great and may be the only way to get something done. You may not have a real alternative at your disposal. And when you need them, they're absolutely life-saving, because without them, you wouldn't be able to get anything done. I'd probably lump also introspection into this particular bucket. Introspection is rarely used, rarely necessary, but when you need it, and there's nothing else you can do. All right, I'm checking my notes here. I don't see that there's any other questions in the queue. Yeah, that covers all my notes at the moment. Many of these examples are already in Xojo in the advanced folder. There's a few of them in here. The web one and the modification to Xojo text are not available yet. I'll have those included with the recording when it's made available, and get them into a future version of Xojo itself. So if you think XojoScript is going to make sense for your applications, by all means, take a look at the example projects, read through the documentations here, ask questions on our forum for maybe some advice on people that have done and added this to their applications, and how it worked. Was it worth the effort? Do their users actually take advantage of it, like any other feature you might add to your product? And see if it's something that will make your apps more useful to your customers. But I don't see any more questions. I appear to cover everything, so it looks like we're done a little bit early today. I want to thank everyone for attending, and I look forward to our webinar next week. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.